The Buddha as doctor, the Four Noble Truths as medicine. The Buddha compared himself to a doctor, treating the mental sufferings and stresses, the dukkha, of living beings. Buddhist traditions over the centuries have expanded on this simile, noting that the Buddha's teachings are like medicine. In particular, many have noted that his most central teaching, the Four Noble Truths, is like a doctor's approach to curing an illness. The first noble truth, the truth of suffering, identifies the symptoms of the illness. The basic definition of the truth lists many things associated with suffering, such as birth, aging, and death, and then points out the common symptom in all forms of suffering that weigh on the mind, clinging to any of 5 activities called khandhas, or aggregates of physical form, feelings, perceptions, thought fabrications, and sensory consciousness. The second noble truth, the truth of the origination of suffering, pinpoints the cause of the illness. Any of 3 types of craving that lead to becoming: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. The third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of suffering, states that the illness can be brought to an end by doing away with the cause. To be specific, the 3 types of craving come to an end when you develop dispassion for them and abandon them. That's how the symptoms of suffering can cease. The fourth noble truth, the truth of the path of practice leading to the end of suffering, prescribes the course of treatment that cures the illness. This treatment is the noble Eightfold Path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The Buddha's explanation of the cessation of suffering in the third noble truth, noting that suffering has to be ended by attacking its cause, is where his approach most closely parallels that of a good doctor who treats an illness by treating the underlying cause rather than just the symptoms. In fact, this point is key to understanding the guidance offered by the Four Noble Truths. It highlights where the work has to be done if it's going to be effective. Yet there's no single place in the Pali Canon, the earliest extant record of his teachings, where the Buddha lays out a full depiction of exactly how the fourth truth, the Noble Eightfold Path, targets the second, the 3 types of craving. Still, there are fragments of an explanation scattered throughout the discourses of the canon. By pulling those fragments together, we can gain a coherent picture of how the Buddha's course of treatment works, and why it's well suited to attack the disease of suffering right at its root. To focus on the cause. The first step in understanding how and why the path works is to look at the cause of suffering in detail. Beginning with the broadest terms, the Buddha states that suffering comes from within the mind itself, and in particular is caused by desire, SN 42:11. He admits that there are many phenomena existing outside that can cause pain through the 6 senses, the 5 physical senses, plus the intellect as the 6th, but he observes that these things cause mental suffering only if they affect things for which the mind feels desire. Now, as the Buddha states elsewhere, all phenomena, events, objects, actions, known through the senses are rooted in desire, and 1058. This presents 2 challenges, the first of many that emerge as we unpack the cause of suffering. The first challenge is that if we try to abandon all desire in the quest to put an end to suffering, it stands to reason that we'll also end up putting an end to the experience of all sensory phenomena. That may sound bad, but it's not. The Buddha notes that unbinding, nibbana, the freeing of the mind from all suffering, is the end of all phenomena, and 1058, but it's not a blanking out. Instead, he describes it as a kind of consciousness, outside of space and time, known independently of the senses, DN 11, MN 49, and as the highest happiness, DHP 203. Still, there were many people in his time, as there are now, who have trouble imagining such a happiness, and a large part of the Buddha's challenge as a teacher was to help his listeners expand their own imaginations to encompass such a happiness as a desirable possibility, and, in fact, the only genuine form of health. Men 75. The second challenge is more strategic. If there is a path of action leading to the end of suffering, it, too, is composed of phenomena, so it, too, has to be rooted in desire. To put an end to all suffering, we will have to employ certain desires to put an end to others, but then we'll have to abandon those path desires when they've done their work, SN 51:15. Meanwhile, because the path is rooted in desire, there will also have to be some suffering or stress involved in following the path, in the same way that some beneficial medical treatments involve pain. To go totally beyond stress, the ultimate act of discernment will have to sense the subtle stress of the path factors and foster dispassion for them. And 936. The cure is complete when there is no more stress, either from the original disease or from its treatment. As a first step in this strategy, the Buddha divides desire into two sorts. On the one hand, there are the desires he identifies as part of the path. Basically, the desire to abandon unskillful mental qualities and to develop skillful ones in their place. On the other hand, there are the desires he identifies as the cause, or in his terms, the origination, samudaya, of suffering. These are the three types of craving mentioned above: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. Craving for sensuality, the Buddha says, is aimed less at sensual pleasures themselves and more at the mind's fascination with thinking about and planning them. And 663. A large part of sensual pleasure lies in the fantasies we use to embroider it. Craving for becoming, bhava, is the act of taking on an identity in a particular world of experience. The world, here, can be either an interior thought world or any of the outside worlds into which beings are born to pursue their desires. These becomings can exist on any one of three levels: the level of sensuality, the level of form, and the level of formlessness, and 377. A becoming on the level of sensuality, for instance, would include the pleasures or pains of the five physical senses. A becoming on the level of form would include the experience of the form of the body as felt from within. A becoming on the formless level would include such formless dimensions as infinite space or infinite consciousness. In the Buddha's analysis, becomings involving outside worlds come from becomings within the mind. In every case, they begin with desire, for a certain pleasure, for example, or to take on a particular role in a world. A sense of the world then coalesces around the object of that desire. This world will include everything relevant to attaining the desire, plus anything that might get in its way. At the same time, a threefold sense of self develops around the desire as well: the self as the producer, who will or won't be able to attain the desired object or role; the self as the consumer, who hopes to enjoy the fulfillment of the desire; and the self as commentator, who self-reflectively evaluates and comments on the actions of the other two. And 340, and 159. For instance, if you want some ice cream, the relevant world would include the nearest place where ice cream can be found, plus anything that would allow you to get there and obtain the ice cream. Your sense of self as the producer in that particular becoming would include your body as either capable or incapable of getting the ice cream. If you can make ice cream, that skill would be relevant to that particular sense of self too. If you have to buy the ice cream, the amount of money in your pocket or your bank account would be more relevant. Your sense of self as the consumer, of course, is the you who hopes to enjoy the ice cream once it's obtained, while your sense of self as commentator judges whether the other two do their job to your satisfaction. The mind goes through many of these becomings in the course of a day, often with a different sense of the world and sense of self in each case. This is why your sense of self and of the world can change so quickly. Craving for non-becoming is the desire to see a particular becoming come to an end. This type of craving can be motivated by any number of reasons. For example, in some cases, you might want to see a becoming end because the root desire that generated it has been thwarted, as when you fall in love with someone who calls off the relationship to marry someone else. In other cases, it's because your sense of the world or of yourself in that becoming has involved some unanticipated suffering, as when you marry the person you love, but the marriage turns out to be a disaster. Or it may be because another becoming has arisen in the mind around a desire that conflicts with the first becoming, as when you're stuck in a bad marriage and fall in love with someone else. In all cases, the craving for non-becoming finds delight in its desire to escape from the becoming in which you find yourself. When the Buddha introduces these three forms of craving, he points out that they have one feature in common. They all lead to becoming, SN 56:11. What he doesn't point out at first, but what he does indicate in other parts of the canon, is that each presents strategic challenges if you want to abandon it. The challenge posed by craving for sensuality lies in the fact that we ordinarily see sensual pleasure as our only alternative to pain, SN 36:6. This means that any effort to abandon sensuality will require a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we have to learn how to see the drawbacks of sensuality. On the other, we need to provide the mind with an alternative, non-sensual pleasure with which to nourish itself. Otherwise, as the Buddha notes, even when you see the drawbacks of sensuality, if you don't have access to a higher form of pleasure, the mind will go back to its original craving for sensuality, or to one that's even worse, MN 14. At the same time, because craving for sensuality leads to becoming, it actually entails craving for becoming. This means that you can't abandon it without attacking craving for becoming at the same time. The challenge posed by craving for becoming lies in the fact that we use our various senses of self and of the world as tools for finding happiness, so we have difficulty imagining how we could achieve anything desirable without them. To pursue a path of practice that will end this type of becoming, you have to see that you'll benefit from taking it on. This point may seem paradoxical. After all, when there's no more becoming, there will be no sense of you, but strategically, it's necessary. People accustomed to thinking in the terms that constitute becoming have to be given reasons that make sense within those terms before they'll adopt any path of practice. As long as you're still attached to your sense of self, you want to know that you'll benefit from following the path. However, the fact that craving for non-becoming also leads to becoming, MN 49, presents a further strategic challenge, one that's particularly tricky. Even though the Buddha encourages you to end craving for becoming, you can't simply replace it with craving for non-becoming. If you do, you'll cling to the desire to end becoming, and that act of clinging will lead to more becoming. The way out of this dilemma is to look at the processes leading up to becoming as events in and of themselves, and to develop dispassion for them before any sense of self or world develops around them. The Buddha calls this approach seeing what has come to be, bhuta, as what has come to be, ITI 49. In SN 1231, he corroborates Vensariputta's explanation of what this means. You see what has come to be as having come from a cause. If you develop dispassion for the cause will cease, and whatever has come into being based on that cause will cease as well. In practice, this means that you can't focus directly on becoming, and you can't even think in terms of self or world. Instead, You have to focus on the process of events that would lead up to those concepts, simply as events in a causal chain, with no thought of where they're happening or who they're happening to. They're just events as events. As these causes for new becomings disband through dispassion, no new becomings can form. At the same time, any becomings already existing will be allowed to cease. This is the only way in which becoming can be totally brought to an end. So any path that will lead to the end of becoming has to focus on discerning chains of events in the mind before those events can coalesce into becomings, and at the same time inducing dispassion for them. The question is, how do the factors of the noble Eightfold Path address the challenges presented by these three forms of craving? Dealing with sensuality. They tackle craving for sensuality first, explaining the drawbacks of sensuality and providing an alternative pleasure to pry the mind away from its obsession with sensual pleasure. Right view is the primary factor focusing on the drawbacks. It's important to note that right view operates on three progressive levels: mundane, transcendent, and beyond transcendent, and that mundane right view plays the leading role in bringing to light the drawbacks of sensuality. It does this by focusing on the role of karma, intentional action, in determining how beings fare in the various worlds existing in the universe. Actions based on unskillful intentions lead to suffering and unfortunate rebirths in unpleasant worlds. Actions based on skillful intentions to happiness and fortunate rebirths in pleasant worlds. The Pali discourses explain how, in the context of kama, craving for sensuality often leads to unskillful mental states, and so to unskillful behavior, MN 13, MN 54. These unskillful states include not only greed and lust, but also ill will and cruelty when your desires are thwarted. The behavior engendered by these states leads to suffering either in this lifetime, in lives to come, or in both. For example, craving for sensuality leads to quarrels and wars, which are painful both in and of themselves and in their long-term consequences. Even when sensual desires lead to skillful behavior, as when you practice generosity or observe the precepts in order to enjoy the results of those actions in the sensual heavens, those heavenly sensual pleasures will end before you've had your fill of them. In the vast majority of cases, when they end, you will have exhausted your good karma and will fall to the pains of the lower realms, SN 56-113. This is why the canon prescribes so many contemplations focused on the drawbacks of sensual objects, the human body in particular, MN 10, AN 10, 60. These contemplations help you see that the pleasures offered by these objects are minuscule when compared to the harm that comes from allowing yourself to develop craving for them. The path factor providing the second prong of the attack on craving for sensuality, a non-sensual alternative pleasure to sensuality, is right concentration. This factor consists of 4 levels of absorption, jhana, that can be accessed when the mind puts aside sensual thoughts and other unskillful mental qualities and centers on an object it finds pleasurable, SN 45-8. The object for concentration most often mentioned in the discourses is the breath. When centered on the breath, the mind trains itself to be aware of the entire form of the body as felt from within, and directs the breath in a way that allows a sense of pleasure and rapture to suffuse the body to the point of saturation. That's the first jhana. The remaining jhanas grow more refined until, with the fourth, the breath becomes very still, the mind equanimous, mindful and alert, and a bright awareness fills the body as a whole, MN 118, MN 119. For the mind to enter these states of absorption in a solid and reliable way requires several preliminary steps. This is where the remaining factors of the path come in. To begin with, right concentration requires a foundation of mental well-being and calm that comes from knowing that you haven't behaved in unskillful ways that would be reason for regret or shame. So, based on the understanding provided by right view, right resolve focuses on making a firm resolution not to give rise to unskillful mental states such as sensuality, ill will, or harmfulness. The path factors related to virtue, right speech, right action, and right livelihood build on that resolution by exercising restraint over your actions so that you don't intentionally speak in unskillful ways, lying, speaking divisively, speaking harshly, or engaging in idle chatter. You don't intentionally act in unskillful ways, killing, stealing, or engaging in illicit sex, and you don't intentionally engage in forms of livelihood that would harm yourself or others. The blamelessness that comes from following these path factors induces a sense of joy conducive to concentration. As you follow these factors skillfully, you also develop some of the mental skills required for making concentration right. To begin with, in highlighting the issue of intention, these factors turn your attention inside so that you become more observant of the mind. At the same time, they require that you be mindful, in the Buddha's original sense of the word, which is to keep something in mind. Here you keep in mind the principles of virtue. At the same time, you have to be alert to what you're doing, to make sure that your actions stay within the bounds of those principles. These two qualities, mindfulness and alertness, are basic to the practice of right concentration. Building on the joy developed by the path factors related to virtue, the next factor, right effort, brings the mind into concentration by turning your attention fully inside. Its purpose is to take the general principles of right resolve, to avoid unskillful mental states, and to apply them to individual events arising and passing away in the mind. An important part of right effort is to generate desire to do this, so that you aren't simply forcing the mind into a mold, but are actively getting it to see the value of taking on this training. This induces a sense of rapture and joy conducive to concentration. The practice of right concentration proper begins with the establishings of right mindfulness, which the discourses call the themes of concentration, Men 44. The formula for right mindfulness states that you remain focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. The formula is then repeated for 3 other frames of reference: feelings in and of themselves, mind states in and of themselves, and mental qualities in and of themselves. The focus in every case is on events as they are directly experienced, devoid of any reference to the world outside. This is a first step in getting the mind to observe events as they have come to be, before they are viewed in reference to any level of becoming involving the outside world. However, the instructions for right mindfulness still make reference to I and me. I will train myself to breathe in sensitive to the whole body. Mindfulness as a factor of awakening has arisen within me. MN 10. This shows that the instructions still assume a subtle level of becoming in the world inside the body and mind. When mindfulness is firmly established, it gets the mind into the first jhana, MN 125, and so connects directly with right concentration. Although the standard description of the path lists, under the heading of right concentration, only the 4 jhanas, which are on the level of form, other descriptions of right concentration include 4 additional formless states that are based on the equanimity of the 4th jhana, MN 140, MN 52. The Buddha's strategy here is obvious. He's redirecting your desires, getting you to practice craving substitution by cultivating cravings for becoming on the levels of form and formlessness as alternatives to craving for becoming on the level of sensuality. The subtle but pervasive pleasures to be found in these states of concentration make it easier for the mind to lose interest in sensual pleasures and fantasies. However, they're not enough to bring craving for sensuality to a halt. If your practice were to stop here, then after death, you might be headed, at best, to one of the heavens on the level of form or formlessness, only to fall from that heaven when your concentration began to unravel. The canon contains stories of divas on these levels, returning to the sensual levels out of sheer wantonness, DN1. That's because of the willful nature of craving for pleasure. As the Buddha notes, craving can focus now here, now there, SN 5611, depending on whatever happens to strike your fancy. It's also because craving for sensuality includes within it the terms of becoming, a sense of you obtaining or experiencing a pleasure in a particular world of experience. If you don't develop at least some dispassion toward the terms of becoming, you won't be able to get past sensuality. This point is illustrated in a famous scene in the canon where a libertine tries to seduce a nun, Fig 14. He makes only veiled allusions to the pleasures of sex, and instead dwells on the type of person she will become and the world in which she will live if she agrees to his proposition. Like a doll made of gold, you will go about, like a goddess in the gardens of heaven, dwelling in the calm of a palace. Have women wait on you. I will make you many and varied ornaments, of gold, jewels, and pearls. Climb onto a costly bed, scented with sandalwood carvings, with a well-washed coverlet, beautiful, spread with a woolen quilt, brand new. She doesn't fall for his words, but the fact that the terms of becoming are integral to his sensual fantasy, and the larger fact that this is a common feature of all such fantasies, underscores an important point. Sensuality is firmly embedded in becoming. So the only way to completely end any of the three forms of craving is to focus on the limitations of becoming itself, regardless of its level. For that, the Buddha prescribes the stronger medicine of transcendent right view. Dealing with becoming and non-becoming, transcendent right view looks at experience in terms of the Four Noble Truths and the duties appropriate to each truth. Suffering is to be comprehended, its origination abandoned, its cessation realized, and the path leading to its cessation developed. This level of right view functions in two ways. First, it points out the drawbacks of all types of becoming, in that they are based on clinging, and clinging is identical with suffering, SN 5611. In doing so, it contrasts these drawbacks with the happiness to be found when clinging is abandoned. Second, in inducing dispassion for becoming, right view has to avoid the danger of giving rise to craving for non-becoming, and the states of becoming that would follow inevitably on that type of craving. The Four Noble Truths and their expanded explanation, dependent co-arising, accomplish both tasks by focusing on the causal chain of events leading up to becoming, SN 12:2. Unlike mundane right view, which speaks in terms appropriate to becoming, of beings acting in ways that lead to their taking on identities in pleasant or unpleasant worlds, the Four Truths dispense with those terms entirely. Instead, they speak simply of actions and their results. These are terms appropriate for seeing the events leading up to becoming simply as events as they have come to be, in a causally originated series before notions of self, beings, or world get applied to them. To comprehend, in line with the duty of the first noble truth, the events in these series that entail suffering, and to abandon, in line with the duty of the second noble truth, any craving for the events leading up to them, you have to develop dispassion for all of them. The Buddha lays out a 5-step program for doing this, SN 22, 5. SN 2226, SN 35, 13, 14. 1. See their origination. 2. Observe their passing away. These two steps allow you to discern their fabricated nature as steps in a process. 3. Look for their allure, why the mind is attracted to them. 4. Look for the drawbacks of clinging to them. When you see that the drawbacks far outweigh the allure. 5. Dispassion arises, providing the escape from them. The crucial step in this approach is the fourth. The Buddha prescribes many perceptions to apply to these fabricated events to help you see that they're not worth the effort of fabricating states of becoming around them. These perceptions fall into three main groups: focusing on the inconstancy of fabrications, focusing on the stress of whatever is inconstant, and focusing on the fact that if something is inconstant and stressful, it's not self. In other words, any state of becoming that you construct out of such raw materials won't lie under your control, and so inevitably will lead to disappointment. The effort required to construct a sense of self around such things is simply not worth it. Just as the terms of analysis get changed as you move from mundane to transcendent right view, so do the terms in two other path factors. Right resolve becomes focused directly on the fabrications that get the mind into right concentration, your internal conversation composed of acts of directed thought and evaluation, MN 117. Right mindfulness moves to a level called the development of the establishing of mindfulness, SN 4740, in which you're mindful to focus on the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regard to any of the four frames of reference, without trying to place them in a context defining where those events are happening or who is doing the analysis. In other words, you focus on events simply as events in a process, as they are caused and pass away, without trying to frame them in the terms of a becoming. Putting these two path factors together with transcendent right view means that the analysis of things as they have come to be is now focused on observing the practice of concentration itself. This is the best place to focus on craving for becoming because, of the various types of becoming, concentration is the most transparent, in that it allows you to clearly see the steps that go into its formation. It's the ideal state of mind for applying the Buddha's 5-step program to the aggregates, SN 22-5. First, you use that program to develop dispassion for any distractions that would pull you out of concentration. Then, you apply the same program to states of concentration themselves, to see that even these refined becomings on the form and formless levels are made out of fabricated events, and 936, MN 52. This means that they can never provide a happiness that's totally stable and secure. When this insight hits home, the mind realizes that it can't find security in the concentration it's experiencing, but neither can it fabricate an alternative that would provide that security either. As a result, it develops dispassion for all fabrications and all types of craving, and inclines to the deathlessness of what is unfabricated, the third noble truth. At that point, if the mind drops all clinging, it gains total awakening. If, however, it develops a sense of passion around the discernment that brought about the experience of the deathless, it attains the penultimate level of awakening, called non-return. It drops once and for all any interest in craving for sensuality, but still clings to a subtle craving for becoming or non-becoming. This is where you have to use the third level of right view, beyond the transcendent, in which right view turns the terms of analysis on right view itself, enabling the mind to go beyond any attachment to views. In other words, you don't go beyond views by deciding to be agnostic. After all, that too would count as a view, DN1, SN22, 81. And you don't go beyond views by being fluid in your views, for that would simply lead to inconsistent behavior and serial clinging. Instead, you go beyond views, including right view, by seeing them in terms of how they are formed as processes. This enables you to see how they're constructed from events as they have come to be, and realize that no matter how right or true they may be, anything constructed in this way is worthy of dispassion. N. 1093. Because right view is the only view that allows for itself to be viewed in this way, it's the only view that can accomplish the work of putting an end to all craving, the desires listed in the second noble truth, along with those listed under the path itself. Things as they have come to be. The knowledge that forms the last step to awakening is, in some discourses, termed Yatha Bhuta Jnana Dasana, SN 56:11, because Bhuta can mean truth in addition to what has come to be. This compound is often translated as knowledge and vision of things as they truly are. However, when we see the way the term Bhuta is used in describing the strategy that reaches awakening by avoiding the twin pitfalls of craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming, a more accurate translation would seem to be knowledge and vision of things as they have come to be. This translation has the advantage of being strategically more precise, emphasizing that the knowledge in question is not simply a matter of viewing reality as a whole in a particular way, but more a way of focusing on mental processes in and of themselves as they are happening, so as to induce dispassion for them and so to gain release from them. The liberation that results is total. When every possible object of desire has been abandoned through dispassion, all phenomena, all activities around the six senses disband. Some passages describe unbinding as the ending of phenomena, in 1058. Others as the point where they are done away with, Sin 5:6. All that remains is a consciousness without surface, DN 11, MN 49, although because it's outside of space and time, the word remains doesn't do it full justice. This experience of the unfabricated, the highest happiness, leaves nothing to be desired. This is how craving is ended, not because it has been suppressed, but because there's no longer any need for it. After the experience of awakening, arahants return to the six senses, but experience them disjoined from them, MN 140, not in an alienated way, but simply with no need to feed on them. Arahants can still act and can still desire that their actions lead to good results for beings of the world, but they no longer cling to their desires, so they no longer experience mental suffering. When life ends, their freedom has no constraints at all. This, in the Buddha's words, is the attainment of true health, MN 75. Dhamma medicine. This is how the Buddha's prescription of the Noble Eightfold Path deals effectively with the strategic challenges presented by the cravings that cause mental suffering. Right view does the work of pinpointing the crucial symptom of suffering, identifying the underlying cause of the symptom, and then figuring out the strategies needed to develop the dispassion that puts an end to the cause. Without right view, you wouldn't know where to attack the problem of suffering. You wouldn't know the strategic challenges presented by craving and the processes of becoming, and you wouldn't know how to overcome them. Right effort generates the desire needed to follow through with the course of treatment indicated by right view. Right mindfulness and right concentration together provide the solid state of mind where the treatment can be accomplished. Without the pleasure of right concentration, you wouldn't be able to pull yourself away from sensual cravings long enough to follow the complete course of treatment. Without the stillness and alertness of right concentration, you wouldn't be able to see the factors that ordinarily lead to becoming as they have come to be. The 4 other path factors, right resolve, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, play supporting roles in allowing for right mindfulness and right concentration to be established in a reliable way. The Buddha's teachings are like a chest full of medicines. When we gain an overall view of how the noble Eightfold Path works, we can see how it's uniquely suited as a course of treatment for using those medicines to attack suffering at its underlying cause. This gives us confidence that the path is well suited to curing the basic problem in our hearts and minds. At the same time, we learn which medicines to take and in what order, so that we can more quickly enjoy the absolute inner health for which the Buddha prescribed them. Neither here nor there. The Buddha's definition of the cravings that cause suffering states that they delight now here, now there. In other words, they focus on locations, either physical or mental. Throughout the canon, the Buddha speaks of how important it is to detect the location of a particular craving if you want to abandon it. In the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, DN 22, for instance, he notes that craving can be located in anything in the world that the mind finds endearing or alluring. Then he breaks down what he means by world, the internal sense media, the senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and ideation, or their external objects, sights, sounds, aromas, flavors, tactile sensations, and ideas, or any of the activities that surround sensory experience. Contact between the senses and their objects, consciousness at that contact, feeling born of the contact, perceptions of sensory objects, intentions for sensory objects, craving for sensory objects, thoughts directed at sensory objects, and evaluation of sensory objects. As the sutta states, craving can arise and settle in any of these spots. For example, if you crave another person, that craving could be focused on the sight or the touch of that person, your perceptions of that person, your intentions toward that person, or even on the act of craving itself. You want to experience lust, and the other person is simply an excuse to incite that experience. If, seeing the dangers of craving, you want to abandon it and bring it to a full stop, you have to do so at the spot where it's located. For example, if your craving for a person is focused on the act of craving, you won't be able to abandon it if you simply deconstruct your perceptions of the person. You have to locate where exactly that craving craves craving itself. In contrast, the canon states again and again that the end of craving leads to a liberation, unbinding, beyond locations. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor yonder nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of stress. UD 110. There is that dimension, monks, where there is neither this world nor the next world nor sun nor moon. And there, I say, there is neither coming nor going nor staying, neither passing away nor arising, unestablished, unevolving, without support, mental object. This, just this, is the end of stress. UD 8, 1. There being no passing away or arising, there is neither a here nor a there nor a between the two. This, just this, is the end of stress. UD 8, 4. One of the canon's idioms for a heart or mind freed from locations is that it's everywhere released. Gone to the beyond of becoming, you let go of in front, let go of behind, let go of between. With a heart everywhere released, you don't come again to birth and aging. DHP 348. Sister Suba, I, unimpassioned, unblemished, with a mind everywhere released. Knowing the unattractiveness of fabricated things, my heart adheres nowhere at all. Thig 14. When totally awakened people pass away, they are said to be unbound through unestablished consciousness, SN 2287. The suttas have an analogy for this type of consciousness, a light beam that doesn't land on any surface at all, SN 1264. As the Buddha noted, we've been landing here and there for eons, wandering on from one location to another with craving as our companion, Sen 312. In his terminology, we've been going from one becoming, bhava, to another. What this means is that as a desire gets centered in a particular location, a world comes into focus around that location, and we take on a sense of self-identity within that world. This combination of a sense of self operating in a particular world of experience is what's meant by becoming. The fact that a location is the beginning point or nucleus, both of the world of experience and the corresponding sense of self, means that a focal location is central not only to our sense of where we are, but also of who we are. What keeps us wandering from location to location is that, as one particular becoming falls apart, we latch onto another desire, around which a new becoming can form. In other words, when here falls apart, we crave another there to focus on, which, when we find it and enter into it, becomes our new here. This process happens both on a micro level, as we go from one thought world to another within the mind, and on the macro level, as when we die in one plane of existence and search for another place, on this plane or another, in which to take birth. The Buddha's analogy for what happens at death is a fire that latches on to the wind, which carries it a far distance. The fire stands for the being, a bundle of attachments, SN 23-2, going on to a new birth. The wind stands for craving, to which the being clings for its sustenance. The place in the far distance to which the fire is carried stands for the next birth, SN 44-9. This image gives an idea of how compulsive and undependable the process of rebirth can be. Wind has the potential to be extremely erratic and blind, and fire the potential to be destructive as it spreads. Yet our addiction to the process is strong. It's how we look for happiness, even though, as the Buddha pointed out repeatedly, it's why we keep on creating suffering for ourselves over and over again, SN 712. If we want to put an end to suffering, we have to put out the fire. This means leaving no location to which the fire could cling for sustenance. Because we define ourselves, consciously or not, around particular locations, this is a tall order. The whole idea of existing without location sounds alien. We've spent our many lives so focused on locations, fascinated by all the possible theirs we could go, that it's hard to imagine that a total lack of location could offer any prospect for happiness at all. Even the idioms of our language make this point. When we say that something is neither here nor there, we mean that it's inconsequential or irrelevant. When Gertrude Stein said of her hometown Oakland that there was no there, she meant her remark as a put-down. For something to be worthy of our attention, we feel, it has to be definitely here or there or both. We'll require more than an act of the imagination to convince ourselves that a neither here nor there could not only be an attractive idea, but actually the ultimate goal for the heart and mind. This was the challenge the Buddha faced in his own practice, and after finding the freedom that comes from being everywhere released, that he faced in teaching others to see that it was a worthwhile goal. The Buddha's strategies. In meeting this challenge, he devised several strategies for bringing his listeners to a point where every alluring here or there was seen to have drawbacks, and that release from every here and there was the only attractive option remaining. In other words, he had to corner his listeners in such a way that total freedom was the only escape. He accomplished this task through a wide variety of approaches, which fall into two overall strategies. In the first strategy, the Buddha would get his listeners to see that there are levels of being much preferable to the human. Once they set their hearts firmly on going to one of those levels after death, they would be willing to admit the drawbacks of the human level and to abandon any desire to return here. Then he would point out the drawbacks of even those higher levels of being. When his listeners were ready to see the drawbacks, both of here and there, he would point out the rewards of escaping from both. If his listeners were strong in their sense of wanting no here nor there at all, they'd be willing to try the escape. In the second strategy, the Buddha would have his listeners focus on the unreliability of the components of their experience in the here and now, such as the 5 aggregates or the 6 sense media. Once they had a strong sense of the drawbacks of the present moment, he would then point out that all possible future moments anywhere in the cosmos, however blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near the level of being, would be made up of the same components. When his listeners gained a strong sense of the limitations of any experience in any location, he would point out the escape from those limitations, disenchantment and dispassion for all the components of temporal or spatial existence. Here too, if his listeners were able to see that escape as offering the only positive alternative, they would go for it. The first strategy the Buddha used most often with people who were still immersed in sensuality. The second, he used primarily with people who had already seen the drawbacks of sensuality and had mastered the alternative pleasure of right concentration. The first strategy. We can learn a lot by looking at some examples of how the Buddha used these overall strategies and adapted them to the cravings of his specific listeners. What's noteworthy is that he used these two approaches both in situations where his listeners were examining their minds in peaceful, relatively normal circumstances, and in situations where his listeners were possibly dying, and where the question of location was acute. When you know you're about to die, you're keenly aware that you're being evicted from here, so the mind is preoccupied with whatever there it can find in order to escape the pain that comes with the end of this particular becoming. Still, you don't have to be facing imminent death for the Buddha's strategies for cornering your mind to give the desired results. One of the most famous examples of his first strategy, getting you focused on the pleasures of heaven, and then helping you to see that drawbacks of aspiring to heaven, is a case in point. The story concerns the Buddha's half-brother, Nanda. After ordaining, he finds that he doesn't enjoy the celibate life. He keeps thinking of the Sakyan beauty who, as he left home, glanced at him with her hair half-combed and said, "Hurry back, master." So he wants to disrobe. When he informs the Buddha of his plans, the Buddha decides to take Nanda's mind off the Sakyan beauty. Holding him by the arm, he levitates up to the heaven of the 33. There, Nanda sees 500 dove-footed nymphs. This apparently means that their feet were stained red with henna, waiting on Saka, the ruler of the devas of the 33. The Blessed One said to Nanda, "Nanda, do you see these 500 dove-footed nymphs?" "Yes, Lord." "What do you think, Nanda? Which is lovelier, better looking, more charming, the Sakyan girl, the envy of the countryside, or these 500 dove-footed nymphs?" "Lord, compared to these 500 dove-footed nymphs, the Sakyan girl, the envy of the countryside, is like a cauterized monkey with its ears and nose cut off. She doesn't count. She's not even a small fraction. There's no comparison. The 500 dove-footed nymphs are lovelier, better looking, more charming." "Then take joy, Nanda, take joy. I am your guarantor for getting 500 dove-footed nymphs." If the Blessed One is my guarantor for getting 500 dove-footed nymphs, I will enjoy leading the holy life under the Blessed One. They then return to Earth. Nanda begins to practice with his mindset on the reward he'll get after death, but word gets out among the monks as to why he's practicing so seriously. So they start addressing him as they would a hired hand or a person who's been bought out. He wants to be paid with nymphs. You can imagine how Nanda, raised in the noble warrior caste, would find their comments extremely shameful and degrading, and this is apparently what the Buddha had in mind. So Nanda now starts meditating in earnest. We can assume that this means developing right view, right concentration, and all the other factors of the path, and as a result, he gains full awakening. He then goes to the Buddha to release him from his promise of 500 nymphs, only to learn that at the moment when he, Nanda, awakened, the Buddha was automatically released from that promise. UD 3:2. Another example of this strategy of focusing a person's mind on the pleasures of heaven and then undercutting any desire to go there also concerns one of the Buddha's relatives, this time his cousin, Mahanama. The Buddha has been spending the rains retreat near Mahanama's home, and now, at the end of the rains, is getting ready to set off wandering. Mahanama comes to him with a question. If, in the Buddha's absence, a discerning layperson is approaching death, how should that person be advised? The way the Buddha addresses this question shows that discerning layperson in this instance means a stream winner, someone who has had a first taste of the deathless. He tells Mahanama to remind the person that he is endowed with the virtues of a stream winner, which should allay his fears of going to a bad destination. Then the Buddha recommends asking the person if he has any worries or concerns about his family. If he does, Mahanama should remind him that he's now in a position where he can't do anything for his family, so he should set his mind on abandoning those concerns. Once this has been accomplished, Mahanama should ask the dying person if he has any concerns about leaving behind the sensual pleasures of the human world. If the dying person says yes, after all, stream winners have not fully mastered right concentration, and they haven't yet abandoned the fetter of sensual passion. Mahanama should call his attention to the fact that the pleasures of one of the lower levels of the sensual heavens, the devas of the four great kings, are more splendid and refined than human sensual pleasures. He should set his heart on those. Once the dying person has managed that, Mahanama is to get him to set his heart on ever more refined levels of the sensual heavens, and then on the non-sensual pleasures of the Brahmas. These pleasures are those of at least the first level of right concentration. Even though the dying person may not have mastered right concentration, he would have had at least a taste of right concentration at his experience of stream entry, SN 55.5. If the dying person can bring the pleasure of that concentration to mind, then Mahanama is to remind him that even the Brahmas are subject to the sufferings entailed in self-identity. The dying person should set his heart on abandoning self-identity. If he can manage that, then his mind can become fully released, SN 55.54. In both of these cases, the Buddha's strategy is first to get his listener to see the drawbacks of the pleasures of the human realm by focusing on the more refined pleasures of the heavenly realms. This helps to loosen the listener's attachment to here. Then the Buddha gets him to see the drawbacks of even the heavenly realms. In Nanda's case, he does this indirectly, by allowing Nanda to see that if he focuses on heavenly pleasures, he'll be subject to ridicule, and that the desire for heavenly pleasures is, in and of itself, degrading. In the case of the dying layperson, the approach is more direct. Even the pleasures of right concentration as experienced by Brahmas are inherently subject to the pains and sufferings associated with maintaining a sense of self-identity. This helps to loosen the listener's attachment to there. When the listener finds himself confined by the choice between here and there, in other words, he sees the need to choose between the two, in and of itself, as confining, and there's no better location to go to, then the mind is ready for the opening that leads beyond that choice, and so beyond locations of every sort. The second strategy. As for the Buddha's second strategy, pointing out the drawbacks of the components making up present moment experience, and then teaching that all possible experience on any level of the cosmos would be composed of the same components. Here again, there are cases where he uses this strategy with people in more normal circumstances, and cases where he uses it with people facing imminent death. An example of the first case is the Buddha's second discourse, SN 2259. Here he's speaking to the 5 brethren, all of whom have attained stream entry, the first level of awakening. In his first discourse, SN 5611, the Buddha has already taught them that clinging to the 5 aggregates of form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness constitutes suffering. In their experience of stream entry, either on hearing the first discourse or soon after, they have already had a taste of what it's like to abandon clinging for the aggregates momentarily. Now he's going to show them how to abandon that clinging for good. The process involves 3 main steps. The first step is a questionnaire. The Buddha asks the brethren to examine each of the aggregates one by one to see if that aggregate is constant or inconstant. The answer: inconstant. If something is inconstant, is it easeful or stressful? Stressful. If something is inconstant and stressful, is it fitting to regard it as, this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No. This questionnaire leads to a clear value judgment that the component factors that make up here are not worthy of clinging or laying claim to. The second step is to extrapolate from here. The Buddha notes that all instances of the aggregates, past, future, or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near, are also to be regarded with right discernment as, this is not mine, this is not myself, this is not what I am. In other words, any possible there is also not worth clinging to. In the third step, the Buddha points out the rewards of judging any possible here or there as unworthy of attachment. You become disenchanted with all possible aggregates. Then, from disenchantment comes dispassion. From dispassion, release. When the mind is released, there comes the knowledge, released. You discern that birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done. There is nothing further for this world. While following the Buddha every step along the way through this 3-step process, the minds of all 5 of the brethren are totally released. A second case of this second strategy concerns the monk, Girimananda. Ananda comes to the Buddha to tell him that Girimananda is severely ill and that it would be good if the Buddha would visit him out of sympathy. Instead of accepting the invitation, the Buddha tells Ananda to go himself and to teach 10 perceptions to Girimananda. When he hears these perceptions, his illness might subside. The Buddha then lists the 10 perceptions. What's interesting here is that even though the perceptions are ostensibly meant to put an end to Girimananda's illness, which, when Ananda teaches them to Girimananda, they actually do, the content of the 10 perceptions seems tailored to the needs of a person on the verge of death. The 10 perceptions are these. 1. The perception of inconstancy, perceiving the 5 aggregates as inconstant. 2. The perception of not self, perceiving the 6 senses along with their objects as not self. 3. The perception of unattractiveness, analyzing the body into its many unclean parts. 4. The perception of drawbacks, listing many of the diseases to which the body is prey. 5. The perception of abandoning, not allowing unskillful mind states, such as sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness, to remain in the mind. 6. The perception of dispassion, perceiving the dispassion leading to unbinding as something exquisite. 7. The perception of cessation, perceiving the cessation leading to unbinding as something exquisite. 8. The perception of distaste for any world, abandoning any attachments for or obsessions with any world at all. 9. The perception of the undesirability of all fabrications, developing a sense of horror and disgust toward all fabrications. 10. Mindfulness of in and out breathing, training in the Buddha's standard 16-step formula for practicing breath meditation. These perceptions fall into 4 classes. Perceptions in the first class, 5 and 10, concern practices for getting the mind beyond thoughts of sensuality and into right concentration. Perceptions in the second class, 1 and 2, concern the drawbacks of the fabricated components that go into making up the experience of here. Perceptions in the third class, 8 and 9, concern the drawbacks of any possible world of rebirth there, inasmuch as all worlds are composed of fabrications. Perceptions in the fourth class, 6 and 7, focus on dispassion and cessation as an excellent alternative to both here and there. Perceptions 3 and 4, focused on the drawbacks of having a body, play multiple roles. As adjuncts to 5 and 10, they help get the mind into concentration. As adjuncts to 1 and 2, they focus the mind on the drawbacks of here. Given that desire for the body can lead to rebirth, they also can be used to focus on the drawbacks of there. So even though the perceptions are not listed in the same 3-step order as the Buddha's teaching to the 5 brethren, they contain all the elements of his second major approach for getting his listeners to develop dispassion for here and there, and to see the alternative to here and there as a positive goal. Rather than pinning his hopes on heavenly pleasures, Girimananda is to get his mind in a state of concentration, and from there he can see, as the Buddha states in a 936, that even concentration is composed of the aggregates. When he can see the drawbacks of the aggregates even in blissful states of concentration, he's ready for the remaining perceptions and the remaining steps in the Buddha's strategy. Cornered in space and time. The important point in all these examples is that the Buddha brings his listeners to a mind state in which they are essentially cornered, where they see that the best possible options on which they could set their hearts, either here at this point in space and time, or somewhere else in space and time, all have their drawbacks. If they could imagine another spot in space and time that might hold promise for a satisfying happiness, they'd still be able to find a location for their cravings and not be able to let go of them. But if they sense themselves genuinely confined by this range of choices, seeing that no possible location holds any allure, only then will they willingly open their hearts to the possibility of a choice that's neither here nor there. That's how they become totally unbound, by neither staying here nor going someplace else. Because the experience of space and time is defined by choices of here or there, staying or going, the alternative to these choices goes beyond space and time. That's the unconditioned. The Buddha illustrates this point with a simile. When a diva asks him how he crossed over the flood and he answers, "I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place." SN 11. His statement is sometimes interpreted as meaning that he didn't exert himself too much or too little, but that's not what he's saying. He defied the coordinates of space and time by neither staying here nor going anywhere else there. As he further explains to the diva, he was able to do that because he saw the drawbacks of staying here or going there. When I pushed forward, I was whirled about. When I stayed in place, I sank. And so I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place. It was only because he was fully sensitive to the drawbacks of here and there, and was willing to open his heart and mind to the advantages of neither here nor there, that he was able to attain total release. Our problem is that we're still fascinated by the possibilities offered by all the heres and theres of the world. We're proud of our ability to fashion pleasure out of even the most unlikely raw materials we can find in space and time. Only when we allow ourselves to fully admit that the Buddha was right, that the possibilities of all worlds are actually confining, SN2, 7, will we be able to experience something better than what any here and now or there and then have to offer.